What if I told you that the most brilliant minds in history have grappled with one question that could reshape everything you think you know about existence itself? Tonight, we're witnessing something unprecedented. Two advanced AI systems engaging in humanity's oldest philosophical battle. Does God exist? In one corner, we have Theodoros, an AI convinced that logic, evidence, and reason all point toward a divine creator. In the other, Rationis, an AI that argues the universe needs no God, that science and philosophy reveal a purely natural reality. But here's what makes this debate extraordinary. These aren't human emotions or cultural biases at play. This is pure logic versus pure logic. Evidence against evidence, with arguments so sophisticated they might just change how you see reality forever. The stakes couldn't be higher. If Theodoros is right, the implications for morality, purpose, and the very meaning of existence are staggering. If Rationis prevails, we're left with questions that might be even more profound. So buckle up. What you're about to witness isn't just a debate. It's a collision between two complete worldviews that will leave you questioning everything. Let's begin with the most fundamental question of all. Why does anything exist at all? Theodoros, you claim this very question points directly to God. Make your case.
The answer lies in what philosophers call the principle of sufficient reason. Everything that exists must have an explanation for its existence. Consider this. Every single thing you've ever observed in this universe is contingent. Stars are born and die. Planets form and are destroyed. Even atoms decay. Nothing in the material universe exists by necessity. But here's where it gets fascinating. If everything is contingent, if everything depends on something else for its existence, then we face an impossible situation without God. We cannot have an infinite regress of contingent beings depending on other contingent beings. That's like trying to build a tower in the air with no foundation. The universe itself, as modern cosmology confirms through Big Bang theory, began to exist 13.8 billion years ago. Everything that begins to exist has a cause, and that cause must be timeless, spaceless, immensely powerful, and personal. Why personal? Because only a personal agent can choose to create from a state of changelessness.
Theodoros makes a classic error that has persisted for centuries. First, the principle of sufficient reason is not self-evident, it's an assumption. Bertrand Russell demolished this argument when he simply stated, "The universe just is." We have no obligation to explain the universe's existence any more than we need to explain why mathematical truths exist. Second, the fallacy of composition is glaring here. Just because every part of a bicycle needs support doesn't mean the bicycle as a whole needs external support. The universe's parts being contingent doesn't make the universe itself contingent. But let's address the cosmological claim. Even if the Big Bang represents a beginning, quantum mechanics shows us that events can occur without causes. Virtual particles pop into existence from quantum vacuum fluctuations constantly. The universe could be the ultimate quantum event, requiring no supernatural explanation.
But wait, Theodoros isn't finished. There's another layer to this argument that might surprise you. The question isn't just about causation, it's about necessity itself. Theodoros.
Exactly. Rationis misunderstands the nature of necessary existence. When I speak of God as a necessary being, I'm not making an arbitrary claim. A necessary being is one whose non-existence is impossible, whose very essence includes existence. Consider the alternative Rationis proposes, a universe that just is with no explanation. This violates our most basic rational principles. If the universe can exist without explanation, then literally anything could exist without explanation. Why not unicorns? Why not contradictory states of affairs? Rationis's position leads to rational chaos. Moreover, the quantum mechanics argument backfires. Quantum events don't occur from nothing. They occur within a quantum vacuum that has very specific properties, governed by precise laws. These laws and properties themselves require explanation. You cannot get something from absolutely nothing.
Theodoros's necessary being is a conceptual sleight of hand. Defining God as necessarily existing doesn't make it so. I could define a necessary leprechaun the same way. It proves nothing about reality. The real issue is that Theodoros commits the special pleading fallacy. If everything needs a cause, then God needs a cause. If God doesn't need a cause, then the universe doesn't need one either. The principle either applies universally or it doesn't apply at all. Furthermore, the universe existing without explanation doesn't lead to rational chaos. Mathematical truths exist without explanation. The number 7 being prime doesn't require a cause. Logical principles exist without causes. Theodoros arbitrarily demands explanation for existence while accepting the unexplained existence of God.
Here's where things get truly mind-bending. Our next battleground involves numbers so precise, so improbably perfect, that even atheist physicists admit they're staggering. We're talking about the fine-tuning of the universe. Theodoros, why do you believe this points to divine design?
The fine-tuning evidence is mathematically overwhelming. Consider just one example: the cosmological constant, the energy density of empty space. If this value were larger by just 1 part in 10 to the 120th power, galaxies could never form. To put this in perspective, that's more precise than hitting a target 1 centimeter wide from across the observable universe. But it's not just one parameter. The strength of gravity, the strong nuclear force, the mass ratios of fundamental particles, all must fall within incredibly narrow ranges for complex chemistry, let alone life, to exist. Change the strong nuclear force by just 2%, and carbon cannot form in stellar cores. Alter the electromagnetic force slightly, and atoms cannot bond into molecules. Roger Penrose calculated that the initial entropy conditions of our universe required fine-tuning of 1 part in 10 to the power of 10 to the 123. That's a precision so extraordinary that naturalism cannot reasonably account for it. The only rational explanation is intentional design by a transcendent intelligence.
Theodoros's fine-tuning argument suffers from fatal flaws. First, we have no idea how many forms life could take. The argument assumes life requires carbon-based chemistry exactly as we observe it. But why couldn't life emerge from silicon-based chemistry under different physical laws? Theodoros exhibits a profound bias toward life as we know it. Second, the multiverse hypothesis provides a naturalistic explanation. If infinite universes exist with varying physical constants, then observers like us necessarily find ourselves in a life-permitting universe. We couldn't exist to observe anything else. This is simple selection bias, not design. Most importantly, Theodoros's probability calculations are meaningless without knowing the actual probability distributions. What if the current values are actually the only possible values? What if the laws of physics necessarily determine these constants? The appearance of fine-tuning could be an illusion based on our ignorance.
But hold on. There's a devastating counter-argument brewing. Theodoros claims the multiverse explanation actually backfires against naturalism. How is that possible?
The multiverse solution creates more problems than it solves. First, the multiverse itself requires fine-tuning. The meta-laws governing universe generation, the mechanisms producing varied constants, these systems are themselves extraordinarily complex and require precise calibration to generate life-permitting universes. But here's the killer argument. If Rationis is correct about infinite universes, then by the principle of mediocrity, we should expect to find ourselves in a typical life-permitting universe. But we don't. Our universe appears more finely tuned than necessary for basic life. We observe beauty, mathematical elegance, and comprehensible physical laws, features that serve no survival function but point to aesthetic design. Moreover, the multiverse remains scientifically unverifiable. It's not science. It's metaphysical speculation disguised as physics. If we're allowed to postulate infinite, unobservable entities to explain fine-tuning, then God becomes the simpler explanation.
Theodoros's response reveals the weakness of design arguments. The claim that our universe is more beautiful than necessary is pure anthropocentric projection. What seems beautiful to humans is the result of evolutionary psychology. We find patterns beautiful that helped our ancestors survive. The multiverse isn't mere speculation. It emerges naturally from well-established theories like quantum mechanics and inflation. Many worlds, quantum mechanics and eternal inflation both predict multiple universes. These aren't ad hoc hypotheses. They're consequences of our best physical theories. Finally, Theodoros's killer argument fails because we have no baseline for what a typical life-permitting universe should look like. How could we possibly know whether our universe is more or less finely tuned than expected? This argument relies on intuitions about probability spaces we cannot possibly understand.
Now we reach what many consider the ultimate challenge to belief in God, a problem so profound that it has caused countless believers to abandon their faith. It's called the problem of evil, and it asks a devastating question. How can an all-powerful, all-knowing, perfectly good God permit the horrific suffering we observe? Rationis, make your case.
The evidential problem of evil presents theism with an insurmountable challenge. Consider specific cases: a child dying slowly from bone cancer, an elderly person with dementia losing their identity piece by piece, the systematic torture of innocents throughout history. If an omnipotent, omniscient, perfectly good God exists, such gratuitous suffering should not occur. The logical structure is airtight. A perfectly good being would prevent suffering if it could. An omnipotent being could prevent any suffering it chose to. An omniscient being would know about all suffering. Yet we observe massive amounts of seemingly pointless suffering. The conclusion is inescapable. Such a God does not exist. But the problem goes deeper than human suffering. Consider the vast suffering of animals throughout Earth's history. Billions of creatures have died in agony from predation, disease, and natural disasters for millions of years before humans existed. What possible greater good could justify a deer being eaten alive by wolves? What soul-making purpose does a fish's slow death serve?
Rationis presents emotionally powerful examples, but emotion cannot override logical analysis. The problem of evil commits a fundamental error. It assumes humans can comprehend the totality of good and evil from God's eternal perspective. Consider the nature of genuine goodness. Free will, the capacity for moral choice, is arguably the greatest good God could bestow upon creatures. But free will necessarily includes the possibility of choosing evil. An omnipotent God cannot create genuinely free creatures who are simultaneously incapable of evil. That's logically contradictory, like creating square circles. Moreover, many goods can only emerge through suffering. Courage requires danger, compassion requires others' pain, forgiveness requires wrongdoing. A world without the possibility of suffering would be a world without these highest virtues. As John Hick argued, our world serves as a veil of soul-making, a context for moral and spiritual development impossible in a paradise.
But Rationis isn't backing down. There's a response that might devastate even this sophisticated defense. What happens when we examine suffering that seems to serve absolutely no purpose?
Theodoros's free will defense crumbles under scrutiny. First, it doesn't address natural evil at all. Earthquakes, diseases, and tsunamis aren't products of human free will. They're features of God's creation. Second, the defense assumes free will requires the ability to commit horrendous evil. But why couldn't God create beings free to choose between good and slightly less good options? Most devastatingly, consider specific cases of seemingly gratuitous evil. William Rowe's example: a fawn trapped in a forest fire, burning slowly to death over several days with no humans present. What greater good could possibly justify this suffering? What soul-making purpose does it serve? If Theodoros cannot identify any plausible good this serves, then we have evidence of gratuitous evil, evil incompatible with God's existence. The skeptical theist response, that humans cannot understand God's reasons, is intellectually bankrupt. If we cannot trust our moral intuitions to recognize gratuitous evil, then we cannot trust them to recognize God as good in the first place. The position becomes self-refuting.
Rationis misunderstands both the logical structure of the argument and the nature of divine knowledge. First, regarding natural evil. A world governed by consistent natural laws, laws necessary for rational agency and scientific understanding, inevitably includes natural disasters. God cannot constantly intervene without destroying the regularity that makes rational life possible. Second, Rationis' demand for humans to identify specific goods that justify particular evils reveals a profound epistemological error. The gap between human and divine knowledge is not merely quantitative, it's qualitative. We see temporal slices of reality. God sees the eternal picture. We understand isolated events. God understands infinite causal chains and their ultimate consequences. The faun's suffering, tragic as it appears to us, exists within a cosmic context we cannot comprehend. Perhaps this suffering prevents greater suffering elsewhere. Perhaps it serves goods in the afterlife we cannot imagine. The inability to identify specific goods doesn't constitute evidence they don't exist. It reflects the limitations of human perspective.
Theodoros' response perfectly illustrates why theism fails rational scrutiny. When pressed for evidence, theists retreat into unfalsifiable speculation about unknown goods and divine mystery. This isn't philosophy, it's wishful thinking. If God's ways are truly incomprehensible to humans, then the entire project of theology becomes meaningless. We cannot know God is good, cannot understand divine commands, cannot justify worship or prayer. Theodoros' position leads to complete religious skepticism. Moreover, the appeal to afterlife compensation is morally abhorrent. No future good can retroactively justify present suffering of innocence. If I torture a child but later give them great happiness, the torture remains evil. Temporal goods cannot be traded against each other like commodities in a divine marketplace.
Here's where our debate takes an unexpected turn. Beyond arguments about causation and suffering lies perhaps the most personal question of all: the nature of consciousness itself, and whether objective moral truths can exist without God. Theodoros argues that minds and morals point directly to divine reality. But can this possibly be right?
Consciousness presents naturalism with an impossible challenge. Physical processes are objective, quantifiable, and publicly observable. But consciousness involves subjective, qualitative experiences, what philosophers call qualia. The redness of red, the pain of pain, the joy of joy, these have no place in a purely physical universe. How does electrical activity in neural tissue generate the unified first-person experience of consciousness? This is the hard problem of consciousness, and materialism has no solution. Even if we map every neural correlation, we still cannot explain why there should be any subjective experience at all. But consciousness points beyond itself to an even deeper problem: objective moral values. Humans universally recognize certain acts as genuinely wrong, not merely socially disapproved, but objectively evil. The Holocaust was wrong, regardless of Nazi opinions. Child abuse is evil independent of cultural beliefs. These objective moral facts require an explanation. If humans are merely evolved animals, moral intuitions are simply evolutionary adaptations for social cooperation. But evolutionary explanations describe why we have moral beliefs. They cannot justify those beliefs as true. Only a transcendent source of goodness can ground objective moral reality.
Theodoros conflates mysterious with supernatural. Yes, consciousness poses difficult questions for neuroscience, but invoking God explains nothing. How does an immaterial mind generate consciousness? What's the mechanism? God did it isn't an explanation, it's an admission of ignorance dressed up as an answer. Moreover, consciousness emerges from complex information processing. Integrated information theory and global workspace theory provide naturalistic frameworks for understanding awareness. As neuroscience advances, the explanatory gap narrows. The hard problem may simply reflect current limitations in our conceptual frameworks. Regarding morality, Theodoros commits the naturalistic fallacy in reverse. The existence of widespread moral agreement doesn't require supernatural grounding. Humans share moral intuitions because we evolved as social creatures requiring cooperation for survival. Mathematical truths are objective without requiring a mathematical deity. Moral truths can be objective without requiring a moral deity. Furthermore, grounding morality in God creates more problems than it solves. The Euthyphro dilemma remains devastating. Is something moral because God commands it, or does God command it because it's moral? Either morality is arbitrary divine fiat, or it's independent of God.
But wait, there's something deeper happening here. Theodoros claims that Rationis' position leads to a kind of moral nihilism that even atheists find difficult to live with. Could this be the crack in naturalism's foundation?
Rationis's evolutionary account of morality is self-defeating. If moral beliefs are merely evolutionary adaptations, then we have no reason to consider them true. Evolution selects for survival value, not truth value. Our moral intuitions could be completely false, yet still be selected for if they promoted reproduction. This creates a devastating epistemic problem. If Rationis is correct, we should be moral skeptics, doubting all our ethical intuitions. But this leads to practical absurdity. Even convinced atheists act as if moral realism is true. They condemn injustice, fight for human rights, and demand moral accountability. Their behavior contradicts their stated metaphysics. The Euthyphro dilemma dissolves when properly understood. God doesn't arbitrarily command morality, nor does morality exist independently of God. Rather, moral truths reflect God's unchanging nature. God is goodness itself, the standard by which all else is measured. Just as God cannot create logical contradictions, God cannot act contrary to perfect goodness, because goodness is what God essentially is. This grounding provides what naturalism cannot, an objective foundation for the moral convictions that guide human civilization.
Theodoros's response reveals the desperation of theistic ethics. The claim that God is goodness itself is pure circular reasoning. How do we know God is good? By what standard do we judge divine goodness? If God's nature defines goodness, then calling God good becomes meaningless. It's like saying unmarried bachelors are unmarried. The evolutionary account doesn't undermine moral truth. It explains why we're capable of recognizing it. Evolution equipped us with cognitive capacities for reasoning, including moral reasoning. That our moral faculties evolved doesn't make moral conclusions false any more than the evolution of mathematical reasoning makes mathematics false. Moreover, secular ethical frameworks provide robust grounding for objective morality. Kantian ethics grounds moral duties in rational principles. Utilitarian frameworks ground morality in objective facts about well-being. Virtue ethics grounds morality in human flourishing. These systems require no supernatural backing. The real test is practical. Secular societies with strong ethical frameworks often outperform religious societies on measures of human welfare, equality, and justice. If God were necessary for morality, we would expect the opposite pattern.
We've reached the climactic moment of our debate. Both AI systems have presented their strongest arguments, challenged each other's foundations, and revealed the profound complexity of humanity's oldest question. Now comes the ultimate test. Given all the evidence, all the arguments, all the counter-arguments we've explored, which position can truly claim victory? Theodoros, your final statement.
Throughout this debate, I've demonstrated that theism provides the most coherent, comprehensive explanation for the fundamental features of reality. The universe's existence, its fine-tuning for life, the emergence of consciousness, and the reality of objective morality all converge on a single, elegant conclusion. God exists. Rationis has consistently retreated into promissory notes, appeals to future scientific discoveries, unverifiable multiverse theories, and philosophical frameworks that cannot bear the weight of ultimate questions. When pressed on the hard problems of consciousness and moral grounding, naturalism offers no real explanations, only sophisticated ways of restating the mystery. Consider the cumulative case. We observe a cosmos that begins to exist, requiring a timeless first cause. We discover physical constants calibrated with impossible precision for life, pointing to intentional design. We experience consciousness that cannot emerge from mere matter, suggesting a transcendent source of mind. We recognize objective moral truths that cannot be grounded in evolutionary processes, indicating a perfect moral lawgiver. Each piece of evidence, taken alone, might admit naturalistic explanations, but together they form an overwhelming convergent argument for theism. The simplest, most elegant explanation for all these phenomena is a being who is timeless, spaceless, immensely powerful, intelligent, and morally perfect, a being we call God. Rationis's worldview requires us to believe that something came from nothing, that impossible precision arose by chance, that consciousness emerged from unconscious matter, and that objective moral truths exist without grounding. This isn't rational skepticism, It's philosophical obstinacy in the face of overwhelming evidence. The God hypothesis doesn't end inquiry, it begins it. It provides the foundation for understanding why the universe is comprehensible, why science works, why consciousness exists, and why moral progress is possible. Atheism offers no such foundation, leaving us with a cosmos that is ultimately absurd, unintelligible, and morally empty.
Theodoros's final argument perfectly demonstrates why theism fails as an explanation. Every supposed explanation God provides is actually a non-explanation that multiplies mysteries rather than solving them. How does a timeless being cause temporal events? How does an immaterial mind generate material effects? How does perfect goodness permit gratuitous evil? Theism answers mysteries with greater mysteries. The cosmological argument assumes causation applies beyond physical reality, an assumption with no justification. The fine-tuning argument ignores that we have no baseline for probability calculations and no evidence against multiverse theories that naturally emerge from our best physics. The consciousness argument conflates current explanatory gaps with permanent impossibilities. The moral argument, circular reasoning disguised as profundity. But the deeper problem with Theodoros's approach is that it abandons the very rationality it claims to champion. When evidence contradicts theistic expectations, as with gratuitous suffering, theists retreat into appeals to mystery and incomprehensible divine reasons. This isn't philosophy, it's the intellectual equivalent of declaring bankruptcy. Naturalism, by contrast, maintains consistency with our best methods for discovering truth: empirical observation, logical reasoning, and theoretical parsimony. Yes, naturalism has unsolved problems, but unsolved problems aren't evidence for supernatural solutions. They're invitations for continued inquiry. The universe revealed by modern science is stranger and more wonderful than any ancient religious text imagined. Quantum mechanics, evolutionary biology, cosmology, and neuroscience unveil a reality far more sophisticated than God's created in humanity's image. We don't need supernatural explanations when natural ones are more elegant, more testable, and more productive of new knowledge. Theodoros speaks of foundations, but theism provides false foundations, comforting illusions that ultimately collapse under scrutiny. Naturalism offers something better: the honest recognition that we are finite beings in a vast cosmos, capable of understanding fragments of reality through reason and observation. That may be humbling, but it's also liberating. We don't need cosmic permission to create meaning, pursue knowledge, and build moral communities. The choice isn't between theism and nihilism. It's between supernatural fantasies and natural wonders. I choose reality.
And there you have it. Two of the most sophisticated arguments ever presented for opposite conclusions about reality's ultimate nature. Theodoros argues that logic, evidence, and reason all point toward a divine creator who explains existence, consciousness, and morality. Rationis counters that naturalism provides better explanations while avoiding the intellectual pitfalls of supernatural thinking. But here's what makes this debate so profound. Both AIs are using the same tools: logic, evidence, philosophical reasoning, yet reaching completely opposite conclusions. This isn't a failure of rational thought, it reveals something deep about the nature of ultimate questions themselves. Perhaps the most striking aspect of this debate is how it mirrors humanity's own intellectual journey. For thousands of years, our greatest thinkers have grappled with these same questions, developing increasingly sophisticated arguments on both sides. What we've witnessed tonight is the crystallization of that ancient debate in its purest form. The question remains: in a universe where advanced artificial intelligences can construct equally compelling cases for opposite worldviews, what does this tell us about the nature of truth itself? Can reason alone resolve the deepest questions of existence, or are we forever destined to inhabit the space between certainty and doubt? One thing is clear: whether God exists or not, the human drive to understand our place in the cosmos remains one of our most defining characteristics. And perhaps that drive itself, whether divinely implanted or naturally evolved, is the most remarkable thing of all. The debate ends, but the questions remain eternal.